Hello, my name's Professor Andrew McDonnell and I'm a clinical psychologist. And my background is I work to support adults, children with intellectual disabilities, autism, some looked after children in managing crises and difficult behaviour. I've recently written a book, excuse the plug, on the subject of crisis management for an approach that I helped develop called the low arousal approach. And in this short talk, I will go through elements of this approach, which is actually based in my book called The Reflective Journey. Because the theme of the entire talk, which I'll come to later, is changing behaviour is about changing our own behaviour first, not the behaviour of the people we support. And although some people might find that as a little pejorative, it's actually quite hard to do in process. So moving on, my book has really focused minds on a generic book on managing difficult behaviours. And it really is that guiding theme, is that a low arousal approach really does mean in crisis situations, keep all arousal levels low. There was a study done quite a few years ago now that showed very much that inadvertent triggers from staff, parents, family, carers often are precursors to escalations in behaviour. So the whole approach is, rather than focusing on the narrative of the child or the adult, we're going to focus on the person. So on the next slide, you will see a really introduction to the concept of low arousal and what it actually is. From my perspective, low arousal is a set of crisis management tools. It was developed in the 1980s. Excuse me, I'll take my glasses off here now at the moment. And it really did focus on what I describe as in the moment crisis management. For example, one of the most common related triggers, as I've said, is demand related challenging behavior. This doesn't necessarily have to be a bad demand either. When somebody's stressed, they're often not processing information very clearly. So what we do in that moment can be misconstrued or misunderstood. The other cornerstone around the approach, around learning around crisis management, including micro skills, how we move, how we step, how we approach people, tones of voice, is actually the concept of reflective practice, which is certainly not something I've invented. Reflective practice is as old as learning itself, which means we reflect on our practice and learning, and we learn for the next time. So what can I do about my behaviour to change something in my behaviour to help me with the next time this situation occurs? So it's not just about prevention, which is still my mantra. Prevention is always better than intervention, but it's also about how do we manage those crises in a dignified, non-intrusive manner. So on the next slide, we're going to start to think about this definition a little bit more. This is an old paper that I wrote mostly for adults with intellectual disabilities. Hopefully some of the people looking at this now will think that was written 22 years ago. Yes, I'm 58 years young. And I was working at this time mostly with adults with a whole collection of difficult behaviours, various mental health problems, learning disabilities, and often in locked settings as well as community settings. And with my colleagues, we were trying to come up with a concept here, which was this concept about whose behaviour needs to be altered. And the definition that we used in this article, and it will change and have evolved since then, it does encapsulate what we're talking about. It's attempts to alter staff behaviour by avoiding confrontational situations and seeking the path of least resistance. And that should say in a crisis. So the low arousal approach, which has now gone international, we do training in several countries, I think over 14 countries at the last count, started with these roots of saying, this is about us again. How do I manage a crisis? Not by just focusing on that person who's distressed behaviour, but focusing on me. And on the next slide, you'll see again that some of the micro skills we're talking about are things that we all nod our heads about all the time. But I have to say, in practice, we don't always apply them. So, for example, when in doubt, shut your mouth is actually a mantra when I'm actually talking to families, staff, supporters, supervising people. Less is more. The more stressed someone is, cognitive research shows us the less likely they are to process the information that you're saying to them. So even words like calm down or sit down, people reach a point where they're not processing what you're saying. And actually what they will process in their amygdalas and their threat mechanisms in their brain is threat. So minimizing verbal interaction. Yeah, I work with some staff that I was talking to somebody the other week actually who says, her exact words were, I'm a talker. I know that when things get a bit stressed around a particular individual I support, that I tend to talk too much. My answer to that these days is, that's what you need to focus on for your response to crisis in low arousal. Because actually you will inadvertently often escalate situations, which has actually had happened in practice. So to be fair to her, she's going to work on those in the moment arguments and disputes and focus on talk less. Reducing environmental arousal, heat, noise, light, there's loads of research that shows these factors really affect us. Yeah, and sometimes they affect us almost at a subliminal level. The number of people I support and work with who have communication issues, but actually often they can't communicate, they're in pain, or it's a hot day and actually they've got a migraine. So again, we need to look at those in terms of reducing environmental arousal and stimuli, working one-to-one, not having lots of crowds of staff around, which often escalates situations in my experience. Big category is about being aware of non-verbal cues, space, gestures, speed of movement. These micro skills, I have to say, after doing 25, 30 years of training in this field, we're not as good at these things as we think we are. And as a general rule, the practitioner who does think they're good at these things often isn't. Yeah, people stand too close, they invade people's space, they stand over people, they raise their voice too much, they use too much commanding language. Yeah, too many gestures is another one. I'm reminded of a colleague of mine who referred to herself as a finger wagger, that she can't help herself sometimes when she gets really frightened or upset, that she wags her finger. Not a good thing to do in someone's line of sight who's distressed or angry. There's also a lot of myths around this work. Some of it goes back to the early days of social psychological research. People like Desmond Morris, who made a great contribution in his book called Man Watching. But what happened is within that book, sweeping generalizations were made about non-verbal communication, particularly in crisis. Folding your arms is aggressive. Being open is not aggressive. I hope most of you listening to this talk today will realize it is a little bit more complicated than that. It depends on the context, the situation, the intonation, a whole raft of things. Yeah, the general rules is to be open in your postures and look at communication. One little trick for the trade that I often work with people with acquired brain injury, and my colleagues do, is that actually in situations where people are really distressed, use the visual supports that are available. Point, gesture. It's actually lower demand than speaking to people. Core to this whole approach, where probably we got into the most trouble over the years, is we made this phrase that low arousal is also about changing our own beliefs about behaviours. In particular, if you believe that someone is doing something on purpose or is carrying out a behaviour that's willful or planned, it actually is going to affect your relationship and how you respond to that behaviour. My general word of advice is people who do not believe that affects them are living in cloud cuckoo land, to be perfectly blunt. Yeah, we are products of our relationships with people. If you shout at me, person A, but I actually tolerate their behavior because I have a good relationship with them, I like them, I can see behind the behavior to their distress, they're traumatized, I'm going to respond differently to somebody I don't know very well who's shouting and screaming to me with exactly the same words. And this applies not just in care, it applies in all settings, customer care settings, call centers, a whole variety of things. But the hardest bit about the approach that I found in the early days is that people wanted to focus on the skills, how you stand, how you approach people, what you do in a crisis, whether you touch people or not. They were more uncomfortable about the idea of reflection. So one of the 3 tips that I give people about training or reading about this approach is, if you want to look at yourself, start by keeping a diary and what we call a reflective log. Think about your interactions with people that are both good and negative, particularly around people who are challenging is the word that I will use, or have behaviours of concern, to use another term. And note what you did well, what you didn't do well. Because we actually think this is a very positive manager. Although crisis management is a small part of what we do, doing it well increases confidence of people. And confident people take risks. Confident people don't restrain people, in my experience. So being reflective is a cornerstone again of the approach. I'm going to come back to this time and time again in this talk. So moving on to the next slide. Yeah. Really the key question that I'm asked a lot of the time is, what is actually a low arousal practitioner? One of our philosophies and approaches is to reduce demands and requests to somebody in a crisis. One of the criticisms of that is that can feel like you're giving in. Yeah. Well, our view is that when somebody's melting down, that's not the time to teach people. So actually we do take a step back temporarily. Yeah, we try to impose fewer boundaries, not no boundaries, which I'll come to later. Philosophically, the people that we train, families and other individuals across all sectors, they tend to have within their driver this idea of not accepting things like physical restraint, seclusion, and certainly the use of sanctions. You have to get away from the nanny 911 super nanny kind of mentality. Yeah. When you place demands and coerce people who are really, really distressed, what you often get as a trigger is violence. For every one person you calm down, there's another individual who will escalate the situation further because you're making threats to them. So, and the other thing I think that's very good about low arousal practitioners, this is a collective term. I mean, we have trainers in organizations, as I said, in several countries. And one of the interesting things is that you get people accepting that they're not there necessarily to fix or change people. Yeah, they're crisis management experts. Their primary job is to take the heat out of the situation and create a sense of calmness. Their job is not necessarily to just think proactively. But remember what I'm going to say throughout this talk again. I am a passionate believer as a psychologist in proactive approaches. It's just if we're not good at the reactive crisis bits, then actually, how do we get someone from melting down into a more thriving, flourishing life? So these micro skills are quite important. But this mindset of manage the behavior first, change it second. Yeah. And when you're managing behaviors, really try to go from the least intrusive. People have a lot of rhetoric in this field all over the world. I go to conferences on restraint reduction. You know, if you think about it, it's an oxymoron. Yes, my job is to reduce restraint. No, your job is to eradicate the use of restraint in care. You know, it'd be a pretty miserable goal to turn around and say, well, actually, I'm going to justify uses of restraint a lot of the time. So this mindset and questioning it is something within my organization, Studio 3, we constantly push people to think about and have that dialogue. There are critics of our approach who say that sometimes we're hippies and we're not into demands and boundaries, but other critics also say that we're too reflective, that we get people to blame themselves for situations. I'm not into the blame game, but I am into people reflecting, learning, understanding. If I'm working with a highly distressed, traumatized individual, I can't fix their trauma overnight, right? But I can fix and focus on my interactions with that person. Yeah. Give you another everyday example. You know, zero tolerance policies on swearing. No, I don't like being swore at. Most people don't. But actually, when somebody's really quite distressed and escalated in arousal to the point that they're not listening anymore, you know, telling people to stop swearing and making demands of them then is quite often going to escalate the situation. You know, if I'm working on children, for example, if they have said some pretty inappropriate things, you choose your moments. When is the calm time to reflect and have a meaningful conversation? It's usually not in the moment. So moving on our next slides with this, what we're focusing on here is these characteristics of the individuals who support low arousal approaches. And as a researcher, I have an honorary post at Birmingham City University. On paper, I think it says visiting professor of autism studies, but my interest is much broader. I'm interested in positive psychological approaches, in skill building, in strengths. So I'm becoming more and more interested in the character strength of practitioners, not just models and approaches or techniques that people can pick out of a book, like I'm a positive behavior support specialist or I'm a CBT therapist. It's about what constitutes a good therapist. So some of the character strength work that I'm interested in, and I've alluded to the work of Professor Martin Seligman, who's helped really promote the idea of character strengths. I haven't got a lot of time to talk about Seligman, but if I use words like learned helplessness, people go, wasn't that something to do with putting dogs in cages and electrocuting them? Yeah, that's the same Martin Seligman 40 years ago, who is now one of the doyens of the positive psychological movement. And again, positive psychological principle says, let's not just focus on repairing people and seeing people as damaged. Let's focus on strengths. So he came up with about 24 character strengths of individuals, and these are traits that you can look at. Similarly, another colleague of mine, Ryan Nemec, who works a lot in mental health services in the US, has really come up again with this strength-based approach. And I've put on these slides, when you look at them, just one site particularly that looks at character strengths. You know, how resilient are you? You know, how patient are you? How tolerant are you? These are character strengths. You know, how optimistic are you in supporting people? And we feel, and my colleagues feel, that there's an awful lot of work to be done as practitioners in the field. Again, getting people to ask the right questions about their own behavior. So moving on to the next slide. What do we think are the good characteristics of a low arousal practitioner? I think asking questions about people's values is really important. I'm an unashamed liberal. I admit it. Often when I talk about restraint elimination to audiences around the world, you will always get an individual or two or 3 even, and people from the training industry particularly, who'll kind of roll their eyes and look at me with sympathy as if to say, you obviously haven't worked with people who are really violent and aggressive. The answer is yes, I have. And yes, I've been frightened and I've been scared in care situations over my career. Yeah, I'm like somebody who believes you get out from behind the desk. That doesn't make me perfect. So some of the characteristics that we're looking at in this include things about your own value base. I think we put human rights at the core and center of all crisis management, be it verbal de-escalation or practices such as restraint and seclusion. Yeah. And that is something I think that's been missing over the years, and even in international research. There's too much of people creating a kind of bimodal distribution. We have staff up this end of the hump, we have the vulnerable at this end. This is an interaction, and one of the important things about that interaction is, how do I start viewing a person not as someone that I need to change their behavior, but someone I need to support? So looking at people's character strengths, that includes the people we support and the supporters, is critical. And I recognize low arousal practitioners a lot. They are very diverse. You know, I remember when I first started working in this field, there was a kind of view that is everyone, as I said, a hippie, card-carrying liberal. Not necessarily. But what it does mean is people share these common values. And one of the probably the biggest core human value is about human rights and human rights-based approaches. And I make no apology that is, I don't think I've ever met a low arousal practitioner anywhere in the world who's been trained in our approaches who doesn't share that value. So moving on, yeah, the kind of character strengths that I think are important around the low arousal approach, and I think it is quite important when we're talking about reflection. I picked a few here, they're not the only ones, and this is about ourselves, not just the people we're supporting in crisis. Compassion. And with compassion comes forgiveness. I am not saying that you forgive everyone for spitting at you, shouting at you, and screaming at you, but you start with understanding the person and showing some compassion. Most of the people my colleagues and I work with have been victims of trauma. They've been through a regulatory and system that's absolutely horrendous for them. Now, that's not the same as excusing their behavior, but it's about contextualizing the behavior. I think one of the interesting ones, a colleague of mine who's a psychologist said, forgiveness is really hard to do in practice. And this doesn't just apply to supporting people with challenges. We do it in our own homes. You can think about a relative or someone you care about that you've had an argument about that went on for an unnecessarily long period of time. Somebody was waiting to be forgiven. So if you don't move first, you end up with festering relationships. Bravery is another thing. We actually teach a lot of crisis management strategy through the three, which I'm not going to talk about today, but they are alternatives to restraint. We don't teach any kind of prone holds or any of that kind of stuff and ignore all the rhetoric with it. But actually, to do our approach well, you have to be quite brave, because we're asking people to not react and lay hands on people in those crisis moments. We're asking people to give people space. Sometimes allowing people to break objects if there's no risk of harm to themselves. That actually requires bravery and courage. Yeah, I'd love one day for staff in care settings to be given bravery and courage awards. It's quite interesting recently with COVID-19 that we talk about our NHS heroes at the moment. They are heroes. I think anyone who says, particularly in the early days of the virus, I'm going to go in and nurse or support someone, and I'm not actually sure how contagious this thing is, but somebody's got to do it. You're frightened, you're scared, but you do it. That's bravery. That also rings bells for me for care workers, families. We're all in that situation. Another good character strength is a very American term, is self-regulation. This is this concept of, to regulate other people, you have to be regulated yourself. And before anyone switches off this presentation thinking, I'm not going to go on a mindfulness workshop, is he talking about those kind of things? Not really. We're talking about clear about what helps you regulate. If it's walking, if it's running, if it's reading books, if it's tuning out. These are things that are really important character strengths. People and staff who actually can switch off from work, that's quite traumatizing. They're quite unique people, but you're not just born with that. It's a skill you can learn in most cases. And I think, again, that idea of self-regulation. Honesty as a character strength means honesty with the people we support and honesty ourselves. I think that old phrase from John Donne, to thine own self be true, is really the last two, because I really think there are many character strengths, but I really think social intelligence is one of the ones I'm really interested in. You know, I've often worked with individuals who are working with looked after children. They know those individuals can be fantastic and really support those individuals well because they see the trauma. Others are working with individuals who are emotionally quite damaged. So social intelligence, turn taking, all the rules of society are a little bit dysfunctional. So actually to work with individuals like that, I think you have to have a high degree of emotional and social literacy. And that's not an easy thing to achieve either. But again, I think quite a lot of these traits, not in everyone, can be adapted and learned if you were a reflective practitioner. And also fairness. So often I see people being punished and sanctioned in care settings, but they're wrapped up in other names. Well, we're not going to give you your reward today. It's one of my favourites. It's punishment. If somebody actually sees something at reward and you've withdrawn it for something they've done, that's punishment and that's a sanction. Sanctions as a general rule don't really help us to proactively learn. And I think also when we're looking at boundaries in a low arousal approach, we want to have as few boundaries as possible. So it's important that when we're in these negotiating processes that we're seen to be fair. So those are the kind of character strengths. Those are kind of what we mean by a low arousal practitioner if we're on this reflective journey. And I'm going to move on now to some other background information about the area. One of the drivers to understanding low arousal is generally understanding stress. I was reminded of this quite a few years ago with a colleague of mine who sadly passed away now, the late Michael Macready, Dr. Macready, who was Scottish. And Michael and I used to have lengthy conversations about reflective practice and stress and the word behaviour. And about 2010, we were having a conversation and decided that we had different backgrounds. He was trained within a health psychology social model. I was trained within a behavioural model. Yes, I dabbled with CBT, eclecticism. He'd evolved his. But we decided we were defining ourselves by specific approaches, PBS, or I'm a cognitive behaviour therapist, rather than actually saying, well, what's something that all the people we work with share as a trait? And the two words that came up were stress and trauma. So one of the things I learned from working with Michael is that we started calling ourselves stress management specialists. I wouldn't say experts. We apply stress at the heart and centre of all the work we do in explaining behaviour, no matter what the presenting issues are. And I think understanding stress and also seeing and perceiving the stress in others can be a hugely liberating part of this approach and can be quite proactive as well. Our mantra is manage the stress and the behaviour will start to take care of itself. Manage your distress, the person's stress. And moving on in the next slides about talking about stress, we also know, for example, that stress is interactional and it's linked to trauma. You know, a number of times I've seen people have what I would call panic attacks or panic anxiety. They're almost suffering from PTSD, undiagnosed in many cases. There's some very interesting North American studies at the moment that look at the supposed hypothesized undiagnosed levels of PTSD in care populations. And the limited data we have would suggest it's quite phenomenally high, maybe even a ratio of 5 or 10, even higher than the average population. So if you're working with people who are stressed and traumatized, then we need to perceive that. And sometimes the individuals we support, they can become incredibly stressed very rapidly and they start to perceive things as a threat to their safety. They're already hypervigilant, but you see that when the stress reduces, people are in a better place. I was again working with somebody who we suspected may have dementia in COVID. Didn't think she did, but she was showing a lot of forgetfulness. But this is a woman who was supported in a group home who also finds being in lockdown stressful. As some of the lockdown in her country, she's not from the UK, I should point out, were reduced, her mental well-being has almost returned. So the dementia hypothesis for her being forgetful and confused has gone out the window. To people understanding, she was highly stressed, that affected her physically. She became very, 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 very confused. As the world has become more predictable and she's less stressed, we're not seeing that. So sometimes we need to see things as symptoms of stress rather than the opposite way around, behaviours that we need to correct and primarily target. Target the stress, it makes a difference. And moving on this conversation about stress and trauma, one element of this is that more stressed we are as individuals, the more we need to assert control. As a general rule of thumb in society with people with a lot of different distressing conditions, the more stressed you are, the more you take control of your small part of your world. It's working with individuals with a label of obsessive compulsive disorder. Yes, it's a ritual. Yes, there are a lot of underlying stresses and complexities in all of these situations, but actually it's also with people who are struggling with control over their life. It's something that they can control. but then they move to over control. But this is also true for staff, and this is critical to the low arousal approach. We're not just talking about the individuals we support being stressed. Stress is transactional in nature, which means it's shared. My stress affects your stress affects me, and vice versa. So we've noticed that stressed staff who become quite concerned about individuals, quite a number of them, not all, can become slightly more over controlling. They start imposing sanctions. Nipping behaviours in the bud is one of the favourite words I hear all the time. Pardon me? That's very super nanny 911, super nanny-ish. You've got to nip it in the bud, stop the escalation. But think about it in reverse. Most of us will experience conflict or argument in our life, or hostility, verbal hostility. But relatively few of us see that verbal hostility escalate to full-blown physical aggression or assault. So actually, the vast majority of people who are going to be verbally aggressive with you, even strangers, statistically, are actually not that likely to then escalate further. Anyway, that's on the research. That's a geeky, nerdy point if you want me to say that. But for the individuals who do experience physical assault and trauma, they will nearly always witness that escalation cycle. So they'll witness someone who swore, shouted at them, become really upset, and then a physical encounter has occurred. So what we have to do is change the mindset that actually to control that situation requires giving up control, giving the person space, not trying to get into a win-lose situation. And my own work, in a small way I've been looking at in this field, is that we have demonstrated some links between the more stressed people are, the more they perceive other people as threatening, and the more likely it is they are going to, as a response, attempt over control back. This is an area that we need to explore an awful lot more in the future about the whole idea of conflict management and conflict resolution. So this idea of control is central. One of the characteristics, again, of low arousal practitioners is they're not hippies, but they're not control freaks. They know when to take a step back. They know it's not a win or a loss. If you're somebody and you threaten me and you tell me to get out of my face and I back off and you don't hit me, then actually I might have acquiesced to your request, but I might have also controlled that situation and stopped it escalating. And this often requires a mindset change in people, which is quite difficult to do at times. On to the next slide. If control is important, we have what we call this battle for control. And I'm going to use this as an exercise for the audience because I'm going to get too bored. And thank you for bearing with me for it's going to be nearly 30 minutes when I'm finished. We developed a questionnaire, my colleagues and I, Professor David Dagnan, who works mostly in intellectual disabilities, for a staff controllability questionnaire. It's called the Controllability Belief Scale. We've published a few norms on this. And within that questionnaire are questions about a person's behaviour, which are either attributing characteristics to the person or to the situation. So, for example, imagine an incident of difficult behaviour you've had in the last month. Could be home or at work. Now, fill out these questions about that particular situation in your mind. And they involve type questions like they were trying to wind me up. They were doing it deliberately. They knew what they were doing. They could stop if they wanted to. They can think through their actions. They're trying to make me feel bad. They know the best time to challenge. All of these are statements within that questionnaire that would be a high perceived control on that individual, which is actually going to increase your stress. On average, the vast majority of people we work with, yes, they have a certain element of control, but they also don't have as high a degree of control as we perceive it. So the opposite questions are, often you'll get individuals asking other questions like they don't know what they were doing, they were stressed, they were traumatized, they were in the moment. These are not excuses, they are a way of reframing how we look at behavior. In my book, I call this the battle for control because it is a constant battle. We're not perfect. I could do this talk with you now, get out in the street. I don't have them very often, but I might end up having an argument with someone. I'll make a confession, and I'm very careful of this talk. I had a slight dispute, you could call it an argument, with somebody who walked out of a garage a month ago who wasn't wearing a mask. Yeah, I'm a great believer in that you shouldn't be using too many sanctions controls, but I'm also a great believer in the fact that if you feel confident enough, you should say something. It didn't go great. It didn't escalate to full-blown violence, but this person wasn't impressed when I just said, shouldn't not be funny, but aren't we supposed to be wearing masks when we go in there? He then used some choice, colourful language, got in his car and went off. Right. With hindsight, did he really learn anything from that? Probably not. Yeah. Would I advocate that everyone does that? No, because we would increase conflict around mask wearing. But actually, sometimes drawing people to attention is part of our job, but not to totally challenge people's assumptions. Didn't insult him. I didn't throw other comments at him. Right? But that's an example of everyday conflict. That could happen tomorrow to anyone listening to this, or a dispute. I think one of the highest sources of conflict in society is disputes that people have over territory and neighbours. Right? It's not really the guy brandishing the knife in Strathclyde, or it's actually, that's the more common violence that our police forces encounter a lot of the time. Disputes. In domestic violence, one of the most common triggers is arguments about turn taking over domestic activities, and that leads to actual violence. So this idea all the time of control is at the heart of this. So with somebody who's quite distressed and traumatized in a low arousal approach, we want to give over as much control as we can to that person because it will help them feel safe, which is sometimes counterintuitive to what we are taught sometimes. So moving on to the next slide, we know that this assumption is over control leads to rules and sanctions, which actually quite often leads to escalation. So moving on to the next slide, what we require at the heart of a lot of our work as a low arousal practitioner and being reflective is empathy. Some people we support do struggle to empathize, but some practitioners struggle to empathize as well in situations. Empathy is at the heart of what we do. And just to give an example from the autism field, but it's relevant to my work in the non-autism field, my colleague Damien Milton wrote a wonderful article about empathy, particularly in the context of autism. He has a diagnosis, he's an academic. And there was quite a lot of literature around sort of 10 years ago talking about people with autism having zero empathy. Well, empathy is a continuum like all traits. It's very rare that you meet 0 or 100%. Damien's a highly empathic individual. And he was trying to make the point in an article that there's a double empathy problem, which I now apply to all my work in all care sectors and other sectors. What he said was, if a person has problems empathizing with you, then by definition, you probably have a problem and difficulty empathizing with them. So we need to see things as a double empathy issue, not placing empathy as a trait in that person. Similarly, the true is all these other character traits I've mentioned, like forgiveness. Again, that's a double issue. It's an interactive, reflective issue. It's not just about this person won't say no and say sorry. So empathy, again, is at the heart of what we do in what we call the reflective journey. Sorry about that. Next slide, please. The other aspect in my work, which is often not talked about enough, is fear. If you look at research literature on challenging behavior, behaviors of concern, managing behavior problems, behavior control, to use all these North American terms that I don't like, one of the things that people don't talk about is they'll talk about stress and staff stress and the stress of the individual, but they don't talk about fear. My first job before I was a clinical psychologist was working as a lowly paid care worker. And there were a few situations which are probably I caused, thinking about it now with hindsight, some of them, that I remember sometimes being quite fearful of some individuals. I'm going to say this as an example. I don't normally, but I'll take a risk. I also had an interest in crisis management because I used to learn martial arts to a very high level. I was also a psychologist. The two things don't go together. In fact, I believe in managing violence. The people with those kind of backgrounds should be kept as far away as possible from caring environments because they have a mindset of teaching self-defense, and self-defense is based on mind over matter. If we're supporting the vulnerable, they do matter in a crisis. So actually it's a different question. But one of the things I learned from this was that controlling your own fear and acknowledging your own fear is part of managing all conflict situations. But you won't find it written about that much. When I say to staff sometimes, are you scared of someone? Often people say, well, no, I'm a bit concerned. I wouldn't say I'm scared. Male and female alike. What we have to do is own that fear because it's part of our decision-making process. It's quite interesting around restraint. I remember there was a book written by the boxer Frank Bruno, he's written a number of books about his mental health decline. There was a phrase that was used by a colleague, which is when Frank Bruno escalated and became aggressive. It's interesting to know whether when he was locked up in the psychiatric service, whether the staff restrained him. My understanding was that they were quite cautious about it. So if you're going to back off from someone because they're big and a threat, why don't you back up off from the 5'2" female as well? There's equal value here. It's about changing our behavior. So sometimes we look at things like restraint, women being restrained particularly, often is sometimes more likely than males because sometimes people can physically overpower people a lot easier. The same is also true with younger children. Too much restraint, in my opinion, occurs in school settings. And we know that from some of the horrendous research, the recent parent survey done by Beth Morris and her colleagues, which included people from Scotland, but also in other constituencies as well. I think something like 1 in 3 parents of kids with special needs in the bias sample it was a large sample, said they thought their kid had been restrained in school. I mean, that's not a high figure, that's an epidemic. And even if we account for the fact that that was a bias sample, it's still quite high. But the opposite of that is people must be quite fearful to be seeing restraint as a solution to crisis. So understanding this fear mechanism is really important to understanding this reflective journey, as I call it. Moving on to the next slide. This fear response is something that we can do something about. I was involved with a piece of research with a colleague of mine, Daniel Rippon, who's from the University of Northumbria, and we looked at staff stress. We published a study recently on it where we asked staff themselves what they found stressful in challenging situations. And one of the interesting things is that fear in community settings, particularly where people were lone workers, perceived fear was quite high. But some of those staff also point out that often when there's other staff around, it escalates the situation. So there lies a paradox for us if we're setting up supportive low arousal crisis management systems. You don't want to actually give people too many weapons in the toolbox, but at the same time, you acknowledge the fear and acknowledge what you can do about it. One of the most simple things we do in our approach with people in that situation is to make sure that managers and support staff and colleagues know checking in with someone just to check they're all right if they've been lone working isn't just something that should be a tick box on a form. It's something that should be common practice in any kind of reflective community. Yeah, and understanding this fear itself is critical to understanding approach. I get frightened in situations. If I'm frightened, often the other person is frightened. It might come out as aggression, but they're probably just as scared as I am. So moving on to the next slide. As I said, it's just a quick comment. We all know that the opposite of fear is courage. I still believe in doing crisis management training, including some forms of physical interventions, which I won't talk about today. Very low key, don't believe in hold downs, all of that kind of bad kung fu. But actually, we know that training can be important to increase confidence for people. Yeah, that's the purpose of it, as far as I'm concerned. It's to reduce injuries to people by people knowing what to do when the chips are down and people are struggling. But it's also about instilling confidence. Yeah, we want people to be more courageous in the job, not wrapped in this mollycoddled world of no risk whatsoever. I'm not going to be able to help change someone's life meaningfully if I can't introduce them to new opportunities. If I'm really scared working with them and fearful, I'm not going to introduce them to the new opportunities. QED, you could write the best well-being, stress support, person-centered plan on the planet. Frightened people will not do it. But part of the core again is to look at courage as well. I see people being courageous all the time in their job. Really, really courageous. And it's something that we need to change the mindset of the language. With fear comes courage and bravery, not just fear on its own. Moving on to the next slide. Similar to anger, a study done in Sweden of staff who were physically assaulted, but it's about 12 years old now. It's a very good study. When those staff were interviewed after their incidents of assault, as they called it and described it in their system, I'm not sure assault is a good word as language. Over half of those staff admitted when they realised it was confidential that they were really angry with the person who's assaulted them. And this included residential staff who knew the person. So that kind of anger can also lead to some very faulty decisions. So in the next slide, as an example, what we need to be careful of is that anger doesn't escalate and that anger doesn't start shaping our own decision making. Yeah, if I'm angry with you because you've hurt me and I'm in a residential care facility, I think I'm far more likely to impose some more control on you. And sometimes this bias around these emotional literacy, we're not even aware we're doing it a lot of the time. We need a colleague or a friend to say, actually, I think that's a bit harsh, or I think you're going over the top there. Yeah, I know you're a bit shaky after this. To give you an example, I often get involved in situations where people have been assaulted. And in good caring organisations, one of the things they sometimes get wrong is opening that Pandora's box of emotion, but then holding crisis management meetings with too many participants, which actually leads to increasing staff fear and anger. It becomes a talking shop for saying, I'm scared, I'm angry. Let's have another big meeting. And now let's decide what we're going to do about this. You have meetings like that without really getting people to focus on their own approach and their emotions first, you're going to have plans and programs with a lot more sanctions in them than you normally would. So moving on to the next slide. In the approach of low arousal, and I know this sounds a bit cliche, one of the cornerstones of the whole low arousal philosophy and ethos is acceptance and understanding. And as I've tried to say to people before, acceptance and forgiveness, they go together. But it doesn't necessarily mean I accept and like what a person has done to me. I don't like someone swearing at me. I don't like someone being physically violent. But in our approach, we sometimes have to accept that we can't fix all behaviours, and particularly overnight. And in my work, accepting that actually can be quite liberating, not negative. We can start focusing on the immediate here and now issues of how I can keep people safe, rather than looking at the promised land and prevention. I have to accept that also you're not a broken version of me. And I'm not here to fix you in some middle-class social model to make you more like me. I need to accept difference as well. And this is true of the work I do in autism and also in other areas as well. I think as de Gaulle said, vive la différence. It's true in this sector as well. So moving on to the next side with acceptance and understanding, we can start thinking now about the principles of low arousal. Again, the free plug, there are a lot more of these principles in my book. And please feel free. You can order it online from the Studio 3 website. But how does this all apply then to the immediate crisis management? And I haven't got a lot of time here, but I've selected a few examples for the last bit of this talk. It's only about 10 minutes again. I know some of you are realizing I said 10 minutes ago, but we are getting close to you getting your cup of tea after this. So a lot of the immediate stuff is there. I remember Rudyard Kipling in his poem, If you can keep your head while all about you are losing theirs, I add, then you're an incredibly good low arousal practitioner, because most of us don't keep our head in crisis. We have all these pejorative things that we don't focus on enough. In the moment of crisis where someone's being hostile, appearing calm doesn't mean the same as being calm. Your heart might be racing. You might actually be really, really struggling. But under the concept of emotional contagion, I need to give that appearance of calm often. So I need to slow down. The number of times in situations we see people rush around because they're frightened and they're scared, and that actually escalates situations. But it's quite hard when your colleague is saying, can you help me with this, that you don't go rushing in. I think that old phrase, fools rush in where angels fear to tread, is so common in our work. It really is. Slowing your movements down can be part of that, making yourself move more slowly. If somebody says, I need help here or I need assistance, I can't stress how these micro skills, people don't necessarily really get them on the various training courses they go on. Often on training courses, you get a bit of de-escalation and a bit of kung fu over a sequence of days. Often what people remember is the last thing they were taught, which is often restraint. De-escalation is what we've got to get people excellent at. And I passionately believe that the kind of training we should be doing with staff and family supporters is even more aggressively down the de-escalation line. Let's get people highly skilled at these micro skills. So even being aware of your own breathing, slow it down. Try to avoid direct eye contact and physical contact. These are physiologically arousing things to do with people in a crisis. When I was first trained, I was taught to try and take control of a situation like this, maintain eye contact with people, assert control. Well, that didn't last too long. I quite often remember getting hurt. Reducing verbal and other environmental demands, getting other people out of the way, reducing the crowds, reduce arousal. I have a distressed person in front of me for lots of complex reasons. I need to reduce all arousal. I need to back off from someone as well, which if we go on to the next slide, removing onlookers particularly is hard to do. We all have heard the concept of rubbernecking. We've all experienced on a motorway an accident where the opposite side of the motorway actually slows down to look, even though most of those individuals don't want to look. It's human nature. So one of the biggest things that we find a lot of the time in schools and in other more group-based settings is when somebody becomes challenging, crowds appear. You saw this with the horrendous case, well, a number of cases in America around restraint-related death recently. Even with police with their video cameras, that the very act of a crowd is actually going to escalate arousal. One of the first things people should do is disperse crowds if they're there from a policing context, which wasn't done in a number of situations. It's an arousing phenomenon. When I try to perform under a stressful condition in front of a crowd, we call it social facilitation. If it's under a strange crowd in a novel situation, I will underperform. So again, we need to bear in mind that removing onlookers, removing that extra audience is critical across all the sectors and the areas we work in. And on to the next slide. avoiding the verbal arguments is incredibly hard to do. As I said, the low arousal mantra, and it's the one point I'll make on this slide, is when in doubt, shut your mouth. If you're not sure, walk out the door or back off, right? People by human nature will argue with people. A very good friend of mine said, Andy, is one of the most non-confrontational experts in your care work. You're pretty argumentative yourself. I have to remind people, I'm not Mahatma Gandhi. I'm work in progress. I'm a fallible human being. Yeah. But reflections means learning on those things. Yeah. Learning about how to detach yourself from these things. And certainly in arguments, and this is true in couples and everything else, once arguments turn into a competition, they turn into not win-win, but win-lose a lot of the time. So moving on to the next slide, we've also got to be aware of these non-verbal cues. This is just a simple exercise because we're going to do the next slide fairly quickly. Look at this picture, stare at the image, look into those eyes. Now, let's move on to the next slide. It's the same person. Can we go back to the previous slide? And now forward to the next slide. The only difference in those two slides is the same rough-looking guy who looks like he wants to have a fight with you in one. He's averting his eye contact and his gaze. And I use this as an example to show people that actually how we're perceived, we've got to be more aware of the bodily cues we give off. For those of you, minority, who haven't realised, this is actually me, that person in the slide. It was taken in COVID. I wasn't in particularly good form that day. And when we were writing the book, I actually suggested that would be a good picture to use. Yeah, it's pre-COVID, but a good picture to use. I'll show you what an angry look looks like. But if you look at that picture there and stare into the eyes there, because the person's averting their gaze, they look thoughtful. They don't look angry. They look sad, is what some people say. So how we even look at people in that immediate crisis, I'm very calm. The frowns, the non-verbal communication is huge in de-escalating situations. So moving on to the next slide, avoiding physical contact means, human touch can be calming. We touch people often to show affection and kindness and warmth, but often with people who are highly arousing, if you touch people and wire them up to things like a galvanic skin response monitor, you will find that all touch is excitatory. It increases arousal. So sometimes when people are distressed, we rush in too much and we use physical contact. Also, with some of the individuals I work with who are quite traumatized, physical contact in those circumstances can also produce flashbacks and other high-risk behaviors caused by the very act of touching them. So it doesn't mean to say that we don't want to show that warmth and kindness, but we should be very wary about invading people's space. Yeah, so it's avoid physical contact in crisis situations. It doesn't mean to say no contact at all, but be very careful because it's one of the most common triggers we see in our work. On to the next slide. Yeah, keeping your distance. I struggle with this to this very day that, I believe that the COVID guidance might have some help for us about social distancing. There are studies that show about social distancing, how it takes place in in different cultures, ranges from 18 inches to up to 6 feet. One of the things about social distancing that's a plus for our work around low arousal is that people are keeping their distance. We've actually been noticing in COVID with some of the clinical work my colleagues do, that there are an awful lot of individuals who have not, I wouldn't say thrive, but they've done quite well in COVID, and we didn't expect them to. Because people aren't invading their space inadvertently more readily is one of the factors. So the idea of backing off, keeping your distance, using gestures, even if you have a second member of staff, I keep stressing this, people, get them out of the line of sight. When you have 2 bodies or 3 bodies in your line of sight, that is arousal producing and it's intimidating. So keeping your distance sounds really easy to do, but in practice, it's really difficult. Next slide, please. Yeah, touch. This is an example of touch as an exercise. I may touch someone like this again because I want to show that I care about them. But if we move on to the next slide, they may be perceiving that I'm going to do this in their head. So if we go back to the previous slide, and then the next slide. Previous slide, and the next slide. Thank you very much, our technical person. You can see, how does the person know when I'm reaching out that I'm going to touch you, or I'm going to do that to you? Don't always assume that your good nature and intent in a situation that's aroused and someone's frightened and scared is not going to escalate a situation. I passionately believe that some of the physical contact we do, sometimes in a controlling way as well, is a great trigger to escalating things to restraint and physical restraint. And actually, if we really want to get really passionate about that, we've got to look at these micro skills more. On to the next slide. I'm nearly finished. Big fan of planned escape in situations. Don't remove the person from the situation. Yeah. Allow two different types of escape strategy. Either give the person space and back off yourself, or give them a safe space to go to. And that can be done in a planned manner. I was working with somebody recently again last year who we've actually been teaching this young man, and he's got communication problems, a learning disability, but we're teaching him about when the fire alarm goes, you go out to the schoolyard, to the safe area. Well, we might use the fire alarm when your behaviour is escalating, but where's your spot to go to? So we've defined a space for him in that area that we're teaching him using visual supports to say this is your safe zone. We want people to learn to regulate, and you don't teach regulation by being deregulated yourself. It's about co-regulation. So what we do in those circumstances is planned escape for me, where things have occurred more than once. If you really want to get serious about reducing restraint and seclusion, start introducing as a mindset planned escape more. The first time somebody has to be restrained, I can be very forgiving of. When it becomes a systematic part of someone's program, that's where we've got a human interaction problem. Next slide, please. As I've said, the cornerstone of all of this is reflective practice, which means debriefing, which is essential. But I like to use the broader title in my work, which is about post-incident reactions and emotional support. Debriefing's become quite a pejorative thing over the last 20 years. You know, somebody's hit you. Have you been debriefed? Yes, tick the box. Somebody gave me 10 minutes of counselling. Tick the box. There is a place for that. But there's the general overall arching framework of, are we emotionally supporting the staff that we are trying to work in very difficult situations? And there's no doubt that actually we can get better at staff stress and support. And again, the paper that I mentioned early on in this talk by Daniel Rippon and myself on staff stress, the qualitative study, I would urge people to read. It's available free online. If you just Google Rippon, R-I-P-P-O-N, and McDonnell, and just put in violence or behaviour, the study will come up. It really is the sort of study that is a cornerstone of what we call reflective thinking, asking staff about what they find stressful in these situations. Yeah, and emotional support in debriefing is one of those that also comes up. Yeah, often people who say they don't need that emotional support, who don't want to talk about it, they're usually the people who do, in a nutshell. So we have, again, to be careful when we're doing this kind of work that we understand that context. Next slide. It's nearly finished for people. Part of this is also just a general idea about how we re-engage with people after distress or distressing situations. And it is a skill, again, re-engaging with people. So my view is to avoid recriminations. I know, for example, in Scotland and in other parts of the United Kingdom, there have been emphases on different kinds of plans on violence reduction using zero tolerance kind of strategies. I'm a bit mixed about these kind of strategies, because often actually saying to someone, I don't find your behaviour acceptable, may be good emotionally for you, but it doesn't help you with re-engaging with the person afterwards. So to me, zero tolerance is something that we need to be very careful of, that it doesn't make people more intolerant as a strategy. So we've got to be clear that if somebody, for example, has been, it's a very simple thing in organisations, that let's, for example, they've been off sick because of a behaviour of concern or a challenge, we need to not just get the adage that you've fallen off the horse, just climb back on. We need to be careful about the emotional support people get to get back to work and re-engage with people. Because in my experience, if we get that right, we get fewer staff sickness and lower turnover over time. Next slide. The final message here of this entire talk is, yeah, it's about us, not them. You know, we inadvertently trigger situations. A true reflective practitioner learns to adapt to this and understand that, not in a blaming way, what I do in these situations can make a huge difference. You know, let's rechange the narrative away from you've got a behavior problem, so I've had to restrain you, as an example, to we've got a problem and I've got a problem with how I can tolerate this behavior or change the context or work with the situation. Next slide. As I said, the COVID-19 crisis at the moment has really shown us quite a lot about our training and our coaching and support. At Studio 3, we've actually introduced quite a lot of live interactive training online. And do you know what? It's actually been quite liberating. We're learning that you don't necessarily have to drive to Arbroath or Timbuktu to deliver training to people well. If you have good materials and you can still do things in small groups. So I would encourage you to look at our website. I'm sorry, it's a free plug, where we www.studio3.org. It's on this presentation. I'm really happy for this presentation to be shared with anyone who's actually watching this talk as well, and we'll be happy also to continue dialogue with people over it. So our low arousal training, you need to think about this as a dialogue. It's not just for care staff. We do a lot of training with families as well. Next slide, please. So my end, and I've probably overrun by 10 minutes, so I sincerely apologize by that. Possibly 14 minutes if my clock is right. I hope that I've not been too patronizing and not been too pejorative about this, but this reflective journey is something that's a cornerstone of managing difficult behaviors in all settings. And I hope today, maybe if it's made you think about one small thing about your own behavior, then I'll be happy that my job has been done. So it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much.